Hey everybody, welcome back to our deep dive into the Gospel of Luke. Last week we kind of just did a very brief introduction, and over the next few weeks we're going to get into the context of the book of Luke. So the background, the context, what's going on behind the scenes, what are the themes before we actually jump into the book of Luke. And so today the big question is, who is the author of the book of Luke? Well, it seems obvious, right? I mean, it's called the Gospel of Luke. But nowhere in the book of Luke is anyone named Luke mentioned. There's no one in any of the Gospels, in fact, that get named as the author of the Gospels. So the authorship that we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, those titles actually come about 100, 200 years later after the Gospels would have originally been written. And those names got tacked on to distinguish the Gospel accounts from each other. And so there was obviously a church tradition that had gone back before this, that Luke had authored the Gospel of Luke. But how do we know this for sure if Luke never mentions his own name in the Gospel? Well, some internal research of the Bible in the New Testament will help us kind of determine who actually authored the book of Luke. If you start in Luke chapter 1, verse 1, the author, whoever he or she may be, gives us an overview of why they are writing this book. Have a look. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. All right, so this tells us a couple of things. First of all, whoever wrote this was not a direct eyewitness of Jesus in Jesus' time on the earth. So this person was someone who met with the eyewitnesses. This person also is someone who conducted a very thorough investigation. They wanted to know everything there was to know about Jesus and what it means to follow Jesus. This person asked all the eyewitnesses and got a really kind of good understanding from multiple people of what actually happened, and then decided to write an orderly account, an account that made sense, an account that followed a specific timeline, account that had a particular purpose in mind. And we'll investigate this more in future weeks. This person seems to be writing to another person, a person named Theophilus. Again, we'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, so we know this person wasn't an eyewitness of Jesus. However, they hung out with the eyewitnesses and they wanted to get the proper understanding of who Jesus was, what he did, and write it in an orderly account. All right, hold that thought for a second, because we are now going to turn to the book of Acts. Okay, why are we turning to the book of Acts? Well, you'll see why in a second. This is from Acts chapter 1. In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up from heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles that he had chosen. And it goes on to describe kind of how Jesus responded to his apostles and commissioning them. And so what we know from this is that whoever wrote Luke also wrote Acts. Okay, this is very important, and you'll see why in a second. So the author of the book of Luke and the author of the book of Acts are one and the same. And so Luke is like chapter 1 or book 1, and Acts is chapter 2 or book 2. This is very important. Why is this important? Well, if you then continue to follow the book of Acts, you'll see that a lot of it is actually in the third person, where it's talking about Peter and it's talking about Paul, and it's saying they did this, they went there, this happened to them. Okay, so this is obviously, again, sort of a person who wasn't there and didn't see all of the events, but hung out with people who did and is reporting back their accounts of what had happened. However, in Acts chapter 16, that third person of they did this, they accomplished this, they went there, it changes to the first person. Have a look at this. Acts chapter 16. Paul and his companions traveled through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. They came to the border of Mysia. They tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them. So they passed by Mysia and went to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Okay, so this is a pretty significant thing. So the gospel, the book of Acts changes from they, a third person account, to all of a sudden now it's we and us. So now this person is now part of the action. And actually for pretty much the rest of the book of Acts, the account of the things that had happened include us and we. So this person has now joined up with Paul and has followed him on the rest of his journeys throughout Europe to spread the good news of Jesus. All right? So this narrows down who could write the book of Luke and Acts to someone who traveled along with Paul on these missionary journeys. Now, there is a lot of different people that get mentioned, and if you read Paul's letters, Paul will mention a lot of those traveling companions, and you can compare those traveling companions that he mentions, like Barnabas and Mark, to the people that worked alongside of him in the book of Acts. And there's one interesting thing that we discover when we do this investigation. In the book of Colossians, we are told by Paul, "Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greetings." So Luke is a doctor. He's an educated man. He's a doctor, and he is one of Paul's traveling companions who sends greetings to this church in Colossae. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11, Paul says, "Only Luke is with me." He's in prison at this stage. Luke is the only person who's hanging out with me. Get Mark and bring him with you because he is helpful to me in my ministry. In the book of Philemon, Paul sends greetings again. He says, "From Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers." So we are told Luke is someone who's dear to Paul, one of Paul's fellow ministry workers, and that Luke is a doctor. Now, why this sort of points to Luke being the author is that all these other people that get mentioned by Paul in his letters of people who worked alongside of him and traveled with him, Luke, they all get mentioned in the book of Acts. Their names get mentioned, but Luke's name never gets mentioned in the book of Acts, which means that most likely Luke is the author of the book of Acts, which means Luke is also the author of the book of Luke. So that tells us that Luke was someone who was a very close friend and ministry partner with Paul. It says he was a doctor. He was highly educated. He was a smart dude, and which is evident because the book of Luke and the book of Acts are written in what is known as High Greek. So the composition of the Greek language that those books use are a bit more complicated and a bit more eloquent than the other books that we have in the New Testament. It also tells us that Luke is someone who does his homework. So he doesn't want to just report on what one person has told him, but he wants to get deep down into the nitty-gritty of talking to everybody and have a really good picture of who Jesus was, how the church started, and what it all means. So hopefully that gives you a picture of who wrote the Gospel of Luke and gives us a picture of what Luke is doing, that he really is this really smart, educated guy. Even though he wasn't an eyewitness to Jesus and in the early days of the church, he came on board and was a faithful ministry worker working alongside Paul, and that he has a heart to communicate all the events of what happened around Jesus and the church so that people will know not just the truth of what happened, but will be transformed by it. We'll dig more into the Gospel of Luke next week, but I'll leave you with that thought. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye.